In the year 1919, this curious political cartoon appeared in many newspapers in the United States and around the world. And if you remember from Chapter 1, this is our old friend Woodrow Wilson, the idealist, the individual who at the peace treaties of Versailles came up with the idea of the League of Nations. Now, let's take a look at this political cartoon. He is holding a ridiculously large branch which represents peace, and then he is handing this olive branch to an incredibly small bird. And perhaps the message that this political cartoon was trying to make way back in 1919 is that this peace branch is too big for this small bird to carry. Now, as a student of history, we know that the League of Nations is operating essentially between the First World War and the Second World War. And there's approximately 20 years that separate these two wars. So, on its surface, you can say to yourself, the League of Nations didn't do an incredibly good job. So, as we examine the title of our second chapter, and as we begin to explore the topic of to what extent was the League of Nations a success, we can't immediately just jump to the Second World War and dismiss the work of the League of Nations. Certainly, if we look at a measurement that the end result was essentially very poor. But there were times in which the League of Nations was doing yeoman's work and was operating so-so. And frankly, if we try to provide a balanced view, there were times in the 1920s in which the League of Nations was actually doing great work, and it gave people hope that Europe could be made new and that the old systems of the 19th century were being broken down and it was a new day. We are essentially going to be looking at ideas such as the work that the League of Nations does after World War I to build this new Europe. And as I mentioned, many of the things that take place in the 1920s are a success, and that the League of Nations gets a lot of credit for that. But we also have to remember that the League of Nations is built upon ideas such as Wilson's 14 points, a new world order, idealism, committees working together to work out problems, international law, a mission which is grander than anything that has ever been done before, and this idea that people need to work together. Now, what makes this system collapse? Is it the structure of the League itself, or was it the grand ideas that Wilson had that just didn't seem to work? As we look at the 1920s, as we've discussed before, there were lots of things that were actually working, and working well in some cases. But by the year 1929, something happens, and the world is turned sideways. And eventually, economic markets throughout the world collapse. And this causes problems for the League and how they are able to do their work. Peace in the 1920s essentially began to rise, and the League's work was noble. But by the 1930s, war had broken out again, and we are going to look at how the League is essentially handling these new conflicts which are arising at the time. So let's think about this chapter from the perspective of four big ideas. First, the work of the 1920s, how it was noble and successful in some cases. We're going to take a look at the structure of the League and see what was it that made this League fall apart. We're going to take a look at the Great Wall Street crash of 1929 and how this economic turnaround essentially had a large impact on the work of the League. And then finally, we're going to talk about this change in the 1930s from peace to war, and how the League will specifically handle situations dealing with Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the Empire of Japan. These 4 big ideas can be illustrated by the focus points. How successful was the League in the 1920s? How far did weaknesses in the League's organization make failure inevitable? How far did the Depression make the work of the League more difficult? And how successful was the League in the 1930s? We'll have a video series on each of these 4 focus points, as well as a conclusion at the end. So please keep up in class, ask questions, and we'll talk more later. Thanks a lot.